Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second annual American Druze Foundation Postdoctoral Lecture at Georgetown University. I'm Osama B. Murshid, the Director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you. The ADF Endowed Research Fund was established at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies in September 2013 with the aim to promote postdoctoral research in Druze and Arab studies. And I can safely vouch that this fund is quite unique in its academic focus and in its global approach to the rich history of the Druze. And I'm very grateful to the trustees of the ADF board for their support of Druze studies and for their commitment to enriching our understanding of this historically significant community. And right now it's my great pleasure to invite my dear friend, Mr. Fadi Zuhairi, chairman of the ADF Board of Trustees, to add his welcoming remarks.
Thank you all for coming. We're honored to have you all here in attendance, sharing our foundation's pride and passion to this fellowship. The American Druze Foundation is dedicated to preserving and celebrating the Druze heritage and culture through research and education. Over the years, we help fund community cultural centers across the nation, and we sponsor documentaries and books aimed at providing better understanding of our rich heritage and shedding light on the human stories of Druze immigrants pursuing the American dream and their unique contributions and love to this great nation. Last year, we embarked into this most ambitious project in the history of the foundation with Georgetown and established the first ever postdoctoral fellowship that's primarily dedicated for Druze studies. Not only it is the first Druze fellowship of its kind, but it's hosted at the most prestigious and only center in the nation dedicated for contemporary Arab studies, led by an impeccable director with outstanding leadership and intellect that I'm proud to call my friend, Dr. Osama B. Murshid. Thank you, Osama, for your leadership and for maintaining such high quality academic standard as clearly evident by the caliber of fellows your department is selecting. From Professor Alex Henley, welcome Alex, to Professor Reem Bailony, my heart is simply filled with pride and joy. In an era of globalization, cultural heritage helps us to remember our cultural diversity, and its understanding develops mutual respect and enables renewed dialogue amongst different cultures. We study the past so it can guide us into the future and inspire us to do better. I see this fellowship having an important role to play toward this objective. This year's ADF Fellowship Lecture is particularly special as it sheds light on a great, courageous leader in our Druze history, Sultan Basha al-Atrash, who instilled tremendous pride and admiration in our hearts. And this lecture is given in this year, 2017, a very special year to the Druzes and followers of Tawhid faith. It marks the 1,000-year anniversary of Tawhid Druze faith emergence. But most importantly, this millennium year also marks our collective generation's commitment to preserve our culture, ideals, and values. Thank you again for attending and for everyone who contributed in making this fellowship endowment a reality. This is a special gift that's self-sustained and will continue on giving for generations to come. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for your very generous comments and for your leadership and friendship in supporting the educational programming of the CCS Fadi. And I would like to note that we'll be hosting a reception at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies immediately following the lecture. And it's now my distinct pleasure to introduce our current ADF postdoctoral fellow and tonight's speaker, Dr. Reem Bailony. Reem received her doctoral degree in modern Middle East history from the University of California, Los Angeles. She's previously taught at Smith College and at Georgetown University, and she is currently teaching a class on the history of minorities in the modern Middle East. She's a board member of the Syrian Studies Association, and I'm very delighted to announce that she will be joining the history department at Agnes Scott College in the fall to assume a tenure track position in Middle East history, so congratulations. Her article on transnationalism and the Syrian migrant public, the case of the 1925 Syrian Revolt, was published in the inaugural issue of Mashriq and Mahjar, Journal of Middle East Migration Studies. and she is currently completing her book manuscript entitled Transnational Rebellion, the Syrian Revolt of 1925-1927, which examines the critical role that Syrian Lebanese migrants played in defining and shaping the anti-colonial rebellion. And tonight's lecture derives from this research project and is entitled The Great Druze Revolt of 1925 and the Syrian Diaspora. So ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you for attending our lecture. And now please join me in welcoming Professor Reem Bailony.
Thank you, Osama. I want to start off by thanking the American Druze Foundation for their generous support, as well as the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown for giving me this opportunity to share my research with all of you here today. It is indeed quite humbling to have this chance to speak about a topic that is undoubtedly near and dear to many of the people in this room. I'll begin the talk with a story many of you here are probably already familiar with. In July 1925, the Druze leader, Sultan Pasha al-Atrash, pictured here in his hometown, launched a rebellion against French mandatory authorities in the Hauran region of southern Syria. In the wake of the Ottoman Empire, the 1920 San Remo Conference had determined that the territories of Syria and Lebanon would be ruled over by the French, not as a colony, but as a mandate to be overseen by the newly created League of Nations. In other words, it was the duty of the French to assure that Syrians and Lebanese would be prepared to govern themselves. Inspired by American President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, and especially the right to self-determination, many Syrians and Lebanese objected to this plan, but to no avail. The French proceeded to divide the former Ottoman territories of the Levant according to a sectarian understanding of the region, as pictured in this map. In 1921, the French signed a treaty with the leaders of the Jebel Druze in the south, establishing it as a separate semi-autonomous state. It was the French governor's willful disregard of Druze tradition and harsh reform policies in the Jebel that provoked the unrest leading to rebellion that summer of 1925. In July 1925, Sultan Pasha al-Atrash sent a delegation to Beirut to complain to the High Commissioner of the Mandatory Government, who received the delegation by having them, the Druze notables that is, imprisoned. In August, after failed attempts to negotiate peace, Sultan Atrash, with the backing of certain members of the newly established People's Party in Damascus, declared a revolt against the French. Pamphlets distributed around Damascus agitated against who they called the imperialists and urged Syrians to arm themselves in realization of their national aspirations. Specific demands included the complete independence and unity of Syria, the free election of a constituent assembly, the framing of a constitution, the evacuation of foreign military, the creation of a national army, and finally, I quote, the application of the principles of the French Revolution and the rights of man, liberty, equality, fraternity, end quote. Despite its local Druze origins, the insurrection of the Jebel struck a chord with non-Druze nationalists across the country. The uprising came to take the form of a widespread revolt, fortified by the use of secular nationalist rhetoric and calls for independence that made their way through the press, political pamphlets, and various public gatherings. Rebels hailed from every cross-section of Syrian society. Druze, Muslims, and a number of Christians joined the ranks of the opposition, representing both rural and urban classes. The revolt, however, was not embraced by all sectors of society. Minority Christian groups, the Maronites in Lebanon especially, were at best ambivalent about the revolt given their privileged status under the French. The revolt consequently increased the stakes for the future political and economic makeup of the Syrian state, especially as it related to neighboring Lebanon and its large Christian population. In turn, it also conjured debates about the nation, what it meant to be Syrian or Lebanese, as well as what role religious identity played in the nation and nationalism. Competing nationalist visions and the mobilizations around them, however, were not confined to the borders of the French mandate. As I shall explore in this talk, They included the participation of Druze and Syrian immigrants in various parts of the world, in Palestine, Egypt, Europe, and the Americas, that together formed an important set of transnational networks. The topic came to my attention in graduate school. I had received a summer grant to conduct preliminary research on my dissertation. This was in the summer of 2011, and my original plan was to travel to Damascus. But as an uprising had just began there, I changed my itinerary to come to DC instead to study the impressive collection of Arabic language journals housed at the Library of Congress. As I flipped through the pages of the early 20th century journals, I came across a peculiar publication called Al-Bayan, the Explanation. This was a New York-based weekly that was founded in 1910 by two Druze immigrants, Suleiman Badour and Abbas Abu Shakra. The journal addressed the concerns and needs of the Druze and Arabic-speaking population of the United States, but particularly the Druze and Muslim communities. This caught my attention because most Arabic-speaking language journals at the time were oriented towards Christians who made up the majority of the Syrian Lebanese immigrants in the United States. As I flipped through the issues of the mid-1920s, I noticed that page after page delved into the topic of the 1925 revolt. Arabic journals in New York fiercely debated the events. What role should those in the Mahjar or diaspora play? Was the mandate necessary? What relationship did the revolt in Syria have to nearby Lebanon? Was this a local uprising representing the agenda of the Druze population or a legitimate nationalist struggle for independence? How could those in the diaspora help, and how could they exercise their patriotism from afar? By the time my three-week research trip was over, I had changed my dissertation completely to study the revolt through its connection to the diaspora. But why study this immigrant connection? In the wake of the Holocaust, Hannah Arendt once wrote in her essay, We Refugees, and I quote, "Refugees, driven from country to country, represent the vanguards of their people." While this quote certainly resonates for many Syrian refugees today, one could also argue that Syrian and Lebanese immigrants of the past also saw themselves as acting as vanguards for their people. Indeed, they believe themselves to have benefited from their experiences with democracy abroad, and as such, capable of positively contributing to homeland politics. More than that, they saw it as their patriotic responsibility and duty to do so. From my perspective as a researcher, however, I was interested in the stakes involved in focusing on the migrant as a historical actor. By employing a transnational lens, I hope to address a gap in the wider scholarship on the Middle East that has neglected the pivotal role of migrants in shaping developments back home. Born out of post-colonial scholarship and an interest in globalization, the move towards transnational studies has questioned the circumscribed investigations of area studies scholarship. In this vein, anthropologists, sociologists, and cultural studies scholars have recently, in the wake of 9/11, reconsidered the role of Arab immigrants, not only in their host environments, but also in their continued connections to homeland. Yet historians of the Middle East in general have been slow to embrace this transnational turn in the wider scholarship. I wanted to know how migrants could help us write history, or in this specific case, how Druze, Syrian, Lebanese migrants could help me better understand the Syrian revolt, the Mandate period, and the interwar period more broadly. In pursuing this project, I was motivated by the principal question of how immigrants contributed to the deterritorialization of Syrian nationalist politics, or in other words, I was interested in how Syrian nationalist politics played out in a transnational space, and whether immigrants enhanced or perhaps even subdued the voice of those Syrians in Lebanon and Syria. Finally, I sought to understand the ways in which the migrant condition acted as a force that connected the local and global as well as the national and international. Although historians of the Middle East had spilled much ink on the revolt before me, nobody had ever thought to analyze the role of the diaspora, despite the fact that by 1925, a considerable and sizable Syrian diaspora had already established itself abroad. By including the activities of the diaspora, my research reframes the revolt as a distinctly transnational affair that unfolded in an increasingly internationalized world. In 1926, As the revolt was transpiring, Philip Hetty, one of the first Arab-American scholars on the Near East, was commissioned to write his book, eventually titled The Origins of the Druze. As the revolt was receiving a lot of attention at the time, particularly after the French bombardment of Damascus, many in the United States were wondering, who are the Druze? And as a funny side note, even Hollywood was inspired by the revolt when they made this 1951 Bogart film called Sirocco, which in all honesty was quite awful, but entertaining nevertheless to see the posters. But I digress. Returning to Hetty. In answering this question, Hetty proclaimed, if ever there was a fossil in history, that certainly is the Druze community. Although perhaps well-intentioned, Hetty and scholars long after him continue to treat the Druze as impervious to the test of time, unchanging in their traditions. For too long, scholarship on the Druze has been subject to an Orientalist tendency to try to understand Druze actions and history through what we know of Druze religious doctrine. This angle, particularly the overemphasis on religious dissimulation, has contributed to the stereotype of the Druze as a mysterious and indecipherable people, and has hindered from their full recognition of their contributions to their various diverse social environments, as well as strip them of their agency as individuals. In what follows, I hope to show that Druze and Syrian immigrants acted as links that connected people and places during the revolt of 1925. As a brief outline of what is to come, I will first discuss the history of Syrian migration, after which I will talk about the politicization of the diaspora, followed by a look at cross-border manifestations of the revolt abroad. I will focus mainly on two organizations, the Syro-Palestinian Congress of Cairo and Geneva, and the New Syria Party of Detroit. As early as the late 19th century, people from the Ottoman provinces of the Levant, what we know today as Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel, immigrated to places as far off from home as Australia, Africa, and the Americas. As a brief side note, I will often refer to these immigrants as Syrians, even though today we might identify them as Lebanese, Palestinians, or Jordanians. Before being identified as separate states, these territories were bound together by market relations, cultural and social ties, as well as a shared history of belonging to the Ottoman Empire that set them apart as the territories of a region often referred to as Bilad al-Sham, or Greater Syria. Upon registering in their new host societies in the 1800s, immigrants from diverse locales throughout Greater Syria, though perhaps more closely attached to their local and particular identities, took on the designation Syrian as an ethnic category by which they addressed themselves to their host societies. But returning to the history of this Syrian migration, most embarked upon their trips in search of better economic opportunity, while others sought a more liberal intellectual environment removed from the censorship of the Ottoman state. The majority of these migrants were Christians, though Druze, Muslims, and Jews also immigrated. In moving about, they were joined by countless others in what is called a great wave of global migration in the 19th century. Aided by new transportation technologies such as the steamship and railroads, people responded to push factors such as slumps in the global economy by seeking opportunity elsewhere. And Syrians were no exception. By World War I, there was an estimated 100,000, if not more, Syrians residing in the United States. By 1920, nearly 500,000 Syrian immigrants lived across the diaspora, mainly in the United States, Brazil, and Argentina. Many started off as peddlers, and pictured on the screen is a 1921 depiction of their migration patterns. But they soon came to establish important businesses and neighborhoods in places like New York's Manhattan, what came to be known as Little Syria. Little Syria boasted a number of Syrian-owned businesses, shops, and Arabic restaurants, and was also home to many of the leading Arabic language periodicals of the time. Other important centers of Syrian migration included Detroit, where many had their beginnings working in automobile factories. Although accurate numbers are hard to come by the 1920s there were probably an estimated 1,000 or more Druze immigrants in the United States. The first to arrive were men, and they comprised the majority of the Druze migrant population well into the 1920s. Much like other Syrian migrants, the first Druze immigrants started off as peddlers who scattered across the country, settling in smaller hubs where opportunity could be found. From West Virginia, where they peddled merchandise to coal miners, they made their way further west as far as Seattle and Southern California, where they likely followed the trail of the gold rush. Oops. In fact, it was in Seattle where the first Druze immigrant organization had its beginnings. In 1908, Al-Bakura Durzia, or the First Druze Association, was established with the aim of fostering a sense of solidarity among Druze immigrants and providing resources and support to those in need. In subsequent years, its branches spread throughout the United States, providing the organizational basis for many Druze organizations to follow. A particularly successful Druze community also took hold in Flint, Michigan. Druze immigrants to Flint and the surrounding area quickly set up their own grocery stores and retail businesses, which many here are no doubt intimately familiar with. As I will show later in this talk, the Druze of Michigan played an important role in the 1925 revolt. But first, a brief overview of the Syrian diaspora's political activities. The experience of migration, of settlement in a foreign place, encouraged Syrians and Lebanese living abroad to question their identities and to reimagine their homelands. The politicization of the Mahjar began with the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, in which Syrians and Lebanese journalists living in Egypt and abroad celebrated or spread caution against the centralizing agenda of the new Ottoman government ushered in by the reintroduction of the Constitution. The revolution spurred a growth of civil society institutions and associations within the Levant and beyond, as Syrians abroad began to articulate nationalist imaginaries that grew out of the works of an earlier generation of literatis. Such endeavors began to attract international attention when a group of reformers organized the first Arab Congress in Paris in 1913. This group of Syrian activists truly believed that they could play a role in bringing about reform in the Ottoman Empire through debates in newspapers, hosting speeches, and more importantly, shining an international spotlight on the Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire. The choice to hold the Congress in Paris was at once an attempt to internationalize their campaign, as well as a reflection of the worldview of the attendees. They sought to place their demands and opinions before Europe, to create a dialogue between East and West. But this was a fairly elite group of people. Their mobility attested to their detachment from the broader Syrian population, who was largely illiterate. One representative from New York, Najib Diab, asserted that the muhajirun, or immigrants, were qualified to speak in the name of the Syrians because they dwelled in lands of justice, equality, and progress, and mingled with civilized people, giving them firsthand knowledge and experience with the benefits of constitutional government. Syrian immigrants doubled down on their efforts in 1919 with the Paris Peace Conference. Numerous groups formed to articulate their differing visions for the future political makeup of the Levant. Immigrants telegraphed European powers, clamoring to have their voices heard. And on the screen is a copy of a telegram by the Bakura Association, the first Druze association in Cleveland, to the Paris Peace Conference, protesting plans to separate Mount Lebanon and Palestine from Syria. French colonial agents who had their eye on the Levant sought to counteract these immigrant voices by propagating for France among Syrian migrant communities in Cairo and elsewhere. Like the émigrés themselves, the French also believed that Syrian colonies abroad, and I quote one report, constituted the intellectual elite of the country. By the time of the 1925 revolt, Syrian diaspora activism was firmly established with a ready network of institutions that could be mobilized around the cause. One such organization that played an outsized role in financing and propagating the revolt was the Syro-Palestinian Congress. While its foundation roots lay in the First World War, the organization took on its name in 1921 when it organized a conference in Geneva, Switzerland, with the purpose of exposing the Syrian question and pressuring the League of Nations to reconsider the French mandate over Syria and Lebanon. Heading the organization was the Greek Orthodox Michel Lutfallah, the Muslim scholar and activist Rashid Rida, and the Druze notable Amir Shakib Arslan. Arslan, who lived most of his life in exile after World War I, played a pivotal role in the organization. He spent much of his time in Lausanne, where he had easy access to international activist circles and the League of Nations. Amir al-Bayan, or the Prince of Eloquence as he came to be known, constantly petitioned the League, stylizing himself as the League's unofficial representative of Syria, who took it upon himself to interpret the spirit and logic of the League of Nations and to remind League members of their purported duties. Arslan also networked beyond the League of Nations, lobbying various European leftist and Bolshevik circles. The Syro-Palestinian Congress operated from 3 places: Cairo, Jerusalem, and Geneva. The center of the hub was Cairo, which housed the executive committee of the Congress. Under the leadership of its main financer, Michel Lutfallah, the executive committee attended to the finances of the organization and played an important role in collecting donations from the broader diaspora. The Cairo committee was also in charge of a robust propaganda network run by what was called the Syrian Information Bureau, which received messages from within the mandate territories via telegrams dispatched from Haifa. Heavily censored by French mandate officials, Syrians within the mandate came to rely on their compatriots abroad to make their voices heard at the League of Nations. This Information Bureau was also in charge of taking minutes, preparing internal reports and memos, as well as disseminating propaganda against the French. The Jerusalem branch was run by the Palestinian notable Haj Amin al-Husseini, with the help at times of the Druze exiles Amir Adel Arslan, Rashid Talih, and Ajaj Nuwayhit. It acted as an important linkage between the activists within Syria and those in Cairo and Europe. Because of its proximity to Syria and Lebanon, the Jerusalem branch could readily receive messages that might otherwise be censored by the French mandate via direct telegraph or post. More importantly, the Jerusalem Committee acted as an important gathering point for subsidies intended for Syria. When the revolt began in 1925, this branch also crucially funneled donations and supplies to rebels within Syria through its channels in Transjordan. Yet it was the Geneva branch of the Congress that received the most international attention. Arslan, who headed the delegation, had maintained important connections to his fellow Druze, Sultan Pasha al-Atrash, who entrusted Arslan with making the cause of the revolt known to the international community. Atrash was a wise man. He and his fellow revolutionaries were clearly aware of the international significance of their mission and counted on the diaspora to spread their goals. This document featured on the screen, and I have to apologize for the poor quality, is a letter by Atrash and other rebel leaders to the League of Nations, letting them know that they had charged the Syro-Palestinian Congress with having their demands heard. These demands were for the cessation of the French mandate and the recognition of Syria's independence in its natural frontiers. As pictured in this photograph, it wasn't just the Syro-Palestinian Congress, but Syrians across the globe who sent telegrams and petitions to the League urging intervention in Syria. At the time, the telegram acted as a revolutionary medium for the expression of political grievances and solidarities, as well as an obvious means of communication. Syrian petitions to the League spiked in October and December of 1925, shortly after the French bombed the ancient city of Damascus. And now I'll be playing a short 1-minute video. Cue to play the video. There we go. This is a silent clip from the British Pathé production that shows images of Damascus after the bombardment, after it was barricaded by the French military. And it gives us a sense of what the military rule that Syrians were subjected to under the French mandatory government. You also get a sense of the styles. This guy has serious tarbouche hair once he takes it off. Meant to suppress rebel entrenchment in the capital, the 2-day bombardment destroyed numerous homes and historical sites, including the Azam Palace, an 18th century masterpiece of Damascene architecture. Conservative estimations put the number of deaths at nearly 1,500. After the bombardment, the revolt lasted for almost another year and a half, largely carried out by rebels from popular and rural origins. They were sustained in their idealistic and quixotic endeavor by propaganda and financial support from Syrians living abroad. The petitions and telegrams were so numerous that the New York Times reported on them, attesting to their efficacy in gaining an international audience. The telegrams used the language of the post-war international order, emphasizing the ideals of humanitarianism and international law. Many, and not just Syrians, accused the French of failing to live up to the spirit of the League of Nations. With a simultaneous rebellion in Morocco, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs was concerned that its image had been ruined among the public, at home as well as globally. The Permanent Mandates Commission of the League of Nations was also worried about public opinion, and so in response to the increased volume of telegrams and petitions, they decided to hold a special session wholly dedicated to the Syrian question. When the session convened in Rome in 1926, members of the commission expressed serious concern that the provisional report on the mandate covering the year 1925 had not adequately addressed the underlying causes of the revolt, nor commented on a number of the petitions. Debates among members of the Mandates Commission revealed not only concerns of the individual members present, but also reflected the concerns of the public at large, a public who ultimately endowed the Commission with its legitimacy as a body overseeing the work of the mandates in a post-war international order. Although the League of Nations ultimately upheld the French mandate, the fact that Syrians near and far made their way into the proceedings of the League shows that they had managed to carve a space for themselves in the sphere of international society. Taking into account the bigger picture, the diaspora's engagement with the revolt played an important role in the reinforcement of post-war normative understandings of international law, sovereignty, and humanitarianism. Consequently, the French found themselves battling a rebellion on two fronts, one within the borders of the mandate, and one in the boundless realm of the diaspora. Support for the rebellion went beyond the work of the Syro-Palestinian Congress. Syrians across the diaspora in the United States, Brazil, Argentina, and Venezuela, which also happened to have a substantial Druze population, debated the revolt in their press, lobbied their local politicians, and raised funds to aid civilians and rebels back home. Although it's difficult to obtain precise numbers, Iyad Abu Shakhra, in his piece on Druze and Arabism, states that Syrians in the United States provided the revolt with half its funds. In order to keep up with the global orientation of the Syrians, the French in turn adopted global tactics. The French believed, and with good reason, that the diaspora had the ability to shape public opinion back home. They kept tabs on Syrian communities abroad, instructed their consular officials to engage in counter-propaganda among various Syrian colonies, and most importantly, hoped to better understand the ways in which immigrant donations were reaching the rebels. As a result, many of the Druze immigrants often found their way into the French archives. As French intelligence reports discussed instances whereby members of the Druze and Syrian communities abroad submitted large donations intended for the cause. The French believed much of the funds to be coming from Michigan, Missouri, and Ohio, where many Druze and Muslims lived. In one such instance, among the few that I found in the French archives, the French alleged that Solomon Joseph of Hannibal, Missouri, collected a donation of, at one point, $20,000 from Druze and Muslims from various US states. The money would be transferred to Syria by his employees, who also had plans to be in touch with Shakib Arslan in Switzerland. In another instance, the French tracked the whereabouts of Joe Jabir and his brother on his trip back home in 1934, stating that he had sent a considerable amount of funds for the revolutionaries during 1925 and was perhaps there in 1934 delivering more donations for the Druze families exiled to Transjordan after the revolt had ended, and I'm hoping that there may be relatives in the room who can tell me a little more. Upon an invitation from the New Syria Party, Shakib Arslan would eventually make his way to the United States to attend a conference held in Detroit, Michigan in January 1927. Oh, there we go. The New Syria Party was established in 1926 and was presided over by the Druze journalist and activist Abbas Abu Shakhra. The principal aim of the organization was to support the revolt and more broadly champion the cause of Syrian independence. The organization claimed to have around 40 chapters throughout the United States, Canada, and even Mexico. Individual chapters were named after prominent rebel leaders such as Sultan al-Atrash and Shakib Arslan. Though the membership was thought to be largely Druze, it did include noteworthy Christian and Muslim participants. By inviting Arslan and other diaspora leaders, such as Nassim Seba, the party hoped to rally the cause, Syrians to their cause, as well as gain the attention of their non-Syrian neighbors. Not all welcomed these visitors from overseas, however, nor the objectives of the New Syria Party. For those who rather placed their faith in the French mandate, Arslan in particular was to be treated as a suspicious alien. His critics were mostly Maronite immigrants who wished to see the realization of a Lebanese state separate from Syria, one that would act as a safeguard for the Christian minorities of the region. Yet they also opposed Arslan for his affiliation with Ahmed Jamal Pasha, the Ottoman governor of Syria during the First World War. Arslan, who was elected deputy to the Ottoman parliament in 1913 and who remained a staunch supporter of the Ottoman Empire during the Arab Revolt, was seen as complicit with the oppressive measures of the Ottoman wartime government in Syria. Based on this controversial history, Arslan's opponents lobbied their US representatives to have him deported on the grounds that he would sow the seeds of dissension among the Syrian Lebanese immigrants of the US. The controversy provoked close surveillance of Arslan and Seba, whose activities and movements spun a web of intrigue and suspicion. The French, who knew of the impending Detroit conference a month before it took place, assigned Commander Zinovy Peshkov, not a French person originally, to follow the movements of the travelers and take record of the proceedings. The State Department, too, upon receiving a flood of protests concerning Arslan's visit, assigned Special Agent Frank Higgins to keep track of the Syrian visitors. Ultimately, the State Department decided against deporting Arslan. Yet his surveillance demonstrated the interweaving of Syrian, French, and US interests at a critical historical juncture. The controversy that Arslan's visit created helps us glean insight into the civic life and attitude of Druze and Syrian immigrants. Those opposing Arslan appeal to their officials to act in their capacity as representatives of a great Christian nation. Meanwhile, Arslan's Druze supporters appeared to situate their diversity within the broader narrative of US secularism and democracy. The Secretary General of the New Syria Party, Abbas Abu Shakra, responded to the accusations against the party by claiming that his party represent, and I quote, not only the majority of the true Syrians of the United States, but 99% of the grand total. The First Druze Association also reached out to their attorneys, calling themselves Americans of Syrian extraction, in order to issue a formal counter-protest against those submitted against Arslan. For Fred Massey or Farid Abu Musleh of Michigan, and yes, he did write an 8-page letter, a handwritten letter to the US Secretary of State, Frank Kellogg, the Christians opposing Arslan were but a portion of a diverse group of Syrians that also included Muslims and Druze. While it was true that Massey identified as Druze, he also wanted to point out that he was, and again I'm quoting him, an American citizen first and foremost, and one who has spent the greater part of his life in America. Massey also spoke in his capacity as a former captain during World War I, and further claimed that there were, quote, many if not more Druze in American uniform as there were Maronites, end quote. In their defense of Arslan, Druze immigrants such as Massey asserted the presence of Druze as part of the American fabric, welcoming Arslan temporarily into their community and thereby substantiating his claims by situating him within a uniquely American discourse. Indeed, in speeches to his American audience, Arslan often likened the Syrian revolt to the American Revolution, depicting the Americans as natural allies. Opponents of Arslan wrote numerous letters to their congressmen and senators, who often vouched for their letter writers, describing them as good and well-known citizens, before forwarding the pleas to the State Department. Likewise, the organizers of the conference had invited local politicians and businessmen to attend their opening ceremony and advertise their cause in local newspapers. All of these instances act as a testament to the deep-rooted networks Syrians of all faith backgrounds had managed to create in their host societies. By way of drawing towards a conclusion, I will now turn to the larger meaning we can draw from this history. With respect to the broader global moment of the 1920s, the Syrian Revolt of 1925 was just one response to the failure of the mandate system in the League of Nations to embody the spirit of anti-imperialism it supposedly represented. By situating the revolt in the broader internationalism of the 1920s, my research brings to life the previously neglected role migrants played in internationalizing Syrian politics. The discourse, interests, and appeals of Syrian immigrant intellectuals and writers reflected a global moment in which the League epitomized an internationalism that appeared to be the order of the day. Whereas many Syrians and Lebanese were critical of the League, seeing it as reinforcing a broader European imperialism, they nevertheless acknowledged that the times called for political organizing on an international scale. In the process, Syrian petitioners gave life to an egalitarian, alternative understanding of the meaning and function of the international system by reminding the League of Nations of its public responsibilities. The work of Syrian petitioners shows us that everyday people challenge those in power to take them seriously. Narrowing it down from the broader international lens to a more local scale, exploring the history of the revolt in the diaspora also contributes to our understanding of Arab American history. In an institutional sense, groups like the Bakura and the New Syria Party lay the foundation for future mobilizations around the question of Palestine, for example, and of future organizations like the Arab National League, the American Druze Society, and the American Druze Foundation. Much of Arab American historiography of the early period has focused on the place of Christians, which is understandable since they made up the majority. But when Druze or Muslim American history is discussed, it is often as a tangent to or in isolation of this wider history. The diasporic manifestations of the revolt tell us a rich story that cuts across the heterogeneous groups of the Syrian diaspora. Because the revolt was, in so many ways, about the geographic and political contours of Syria and Lebanon, studying the revolt through the immigrant involvement also bears insight on the ways in which the diaspora made sense of their differences, how different social groups and presses came to represent Syria or Lebanon, how Arab nationalism emerged as a response to particularism, or how Lebanese and Syrian nationalism emerged as a response to geographic and political realities. Finally, what are the implications of this research for Druze history? With respect to Druze history in particular, the work of El-Bayan in the United States and the Druze immigrant activists in the diaspora show us that the Druze community, contrary to popular depictions, were not simply an isolated or mysterious minority. Religious doctrine alone cannot fully help us understand the role the Druze inside and outside the mandate played in the 1925 revolt. By acknowledging the history of the activities of the Druze diaspora, we come to see how they actively contributed in the civil society of their host countries, formed important networks among Arabic and non-Arabic speaking populations and communities, developed relationships with local and international politicians, and finally made a place for themselves in their homes away from home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reem, for this edifying talk and for making us think not only about the transnational networks that supported the Druze revolt, but also may have shaped understanding of Druze identity on a trans-regional level. So we are supposed to be setting up a microphone in the middle aisle. It'll give us a chance to fight the cold by moving around, I think. So if you don't mind making your way to the microphone and stating your name before you ask your question.
Hi, my name is Amal Mudallili. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting lecture. I worked on Arab American media, the history of Arab American media, and I used the Alexa Nav collection, and I have two questions about that. Basically, I was working on the first Arab American or Lebanese American woman journalist, Afifa Karam. But I came across in the Alexa Nav collection at the American History Museum documents from Hasbaya and Rashaya written by Druze to the French refusing to become part of Lebanon. They wanted to stay part of Syria. They wanted to keep Syria. I was wondering if within the community here in New York and Michigan, wherever. Was that division apparent at that time in your research? Because I didn't go through that. The second question is concerning what I found about how they saw their role vis-a-vis the old world, as they called it. And they were saying that their mission, the mission of the new world and the new Arabs here, or Lebanese here, or Syrians, is to take democracy and teach the people back home. Did you see something like this in your research?
Yes, thank you so much for bringing up Rashaya. It makes up a chapter of one of my books, but an important battle took place in Rashaya in 1925 when the Druze from the southern part of Syria crossed into the border into the southern part of Lebanon. And this caused quite a controversy because the French suppression of that battle in Rashaya was quite violent. They came in with airplanes, and many of the homes were destroyed in Rashaya. And the population in Rashaya is a mix of mainly Greek Orthodox and Druze. So following the battle, after the French retook the town, there was some controversy over who had caused much of the destruction. And there emerged this transnational campaign for reparations among the Greek Orthodox of the community, and these are the letters that I found in the Lexinaf collection. I didn't actually see any from the Druze communities, but I found letters from actually descendants of, or her uncle, I think, to his family back home, talking about how they were demanding that the French rebuild the town of Rashaya. And they had all of these demands about what they wanted before they would go back to living with their Druze neighbors. And this included the rebuilding of towns, compensation, because it was the duty of the French government to protect the Christians of Lebanon. And so I found that this transnational campaign over Rashaya happened both among the Druze and among the Greek Orthodox of the United States. And so this was quite a big controversy where people were vying for who controlled the Menkubin of Rashaya, who could speak for the victims of Rashaya. And so that was one aspect that I looked into, and the ways in which, Lebanese nationalism emerges as a response to this incident. To answer your second question, the Druze and Syrian immigrants in general saw themselves as acting as spokespersons for their people back home. And they felt that they were better suited to do so because of their experiences with constitutional government, representative democracy, and so on. And so they often framed their participation in the politics of homeland in this way. Thank you for that very lovely question.
Hi, Reem.
Hi.
So my question is, what is your verdict then? Were there different perceptions of the revolt when the Syrians themselves and the Syrians of the diaspora? Was it an Arab nationalist uprising, or was it something much more localized and more Druze?
It depends on who you read. For somebody like Amir Shakib Arslan, this was an Arab affair. And those people who supported the rebellion oftentimes were well aware of other rebellions taking place in the Arab world, such as in Morocco, in Iraq, and saw themselves as acting in this sort of global moment of anti-imperialism. If you read the newspapers of Al-Huda, for example, which was the main Maronite organ in the United States, you get a very different picture. This was a rebellion that sought to put a wrench in the works of Lebanon, to make Lebanon as a reality become more complicated. And they were concerned that the revolt, if spread too far into Lebanon, might threaten Lebanon's sovereignty. So I don't think there is a verdict on that one, but certainly the rebels who participated in the rebellion, at least at the level of the leadership, saw themselves as leading a Syrian nationalist uprising.
So if my follow-up, is this the main factor in this cleavage between the factions that sort of supported Shakib Arslan versus those who were opposed to his visit? Was it the idea of an independent Lebanon, or was it whether this was nationalist or Arabist? Or?
The way I read it, it was about their heterogeneity coming to the fore, and the fact that the political reality of Lebanon, or the reality of Lebanon, was becoming more and more clear. And the Maronites in particular of the United States saw themselves more and more as Lebanese. And it's during this time that you begin to see the term Lebanese become more popular among the diaspora community.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Reem, for this fascinating talk. I had one question, and you alluded a little bit to this, but I'm curious about the American officials and the way in which they viewed the activism of the Syrian community. So you gave us one example in which there was some monitoring or some attempt on the part of the French to get the Americans to deport important leaders. So my question was, like, how was the press viewed? Were there attempts to censor the press at other moments? Was there more monitoring, or were they left to function largely independently?
Thank you for that. Good question. They were left to mostly do their own thing. The State Department was in touch with the U.S. Embassy in Beirut and had gotten their take on Arslan. And that was mostly a positive depiction of Arslan as this notable figure from the Shuf who did a lot of work around the League of Nations and had acquired a legal visa to come to the United States. And from a legal standpoint, that was all that mattered, that he was in the United States legally on a legal visitor's visa. But the special agent who followed the Syrian travelers around had his own, I think, racially tinged opinion of Arslan and Seba, and I think it has to do with the isolationist moment that the 1920s was witnessing. At one point in his reports, he states that Arslan went to a meeting in New York that wasn't strictly for Syrians, but I'm forgetting the name of the organization, but that appeared to be an organization that included Black Americans, that spoke about revolutionary goals in China and elsewhere, and he looked down upon sort of the late racial mingling that was taking place at this meeting. And one of the ways that they did hinder the mission of the two was to take away the credentials that Seba had been using to fundraise for victims. So Seba was there on a fundraising mission, whereas Shakib Arslan was there as, like a politician of sorts. And he had received a credential from an American figure in Egypt, in Cairo, where he came from. He was originally from Tripoli, stating that, this guy is a great person, I know him very well, and so on. And the State Department, when they learned that he was using this as sort of a way to network with non-Syrian institutions, I think it went against some sort of rule or procedure, and they took that letter away from him, which Seba was very upset about and said that it had thrown a wrench in his completely in his project, and he had to leave early because he didn't have that letter anymore. But that was the only thing that really kind of they did to sort of get in the way, but mostly they just, at this point in time, let them do their own thing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Since the floor is mine, right? In your studies of Shakib Arslan, and specifically his visit to the United States, do you have any insights into some of his speeches or anything that he may have penned at the time?
I don't. I haven't had a chance to go through the press, which I think is probably where a lot of those speeches will be, and the Arabic press, that is. So I have glimpses of some of the early speeches that he gave, especially when he landed in the port of New York. But I don't actually have like minutes or proceedings, word for word proceedings of the actual convention itself just yet. So I haven't been able to figure that out.
And basically during this trip, he was in fact representing himself as a Druze, right? Not as a, because there's a lot of question about whether he'd converted by that time or not. Right?
That's a good question. I don't think it comes up very much. I think there was a question among his opponents that he was coming to the United States as a representative of Syria at the League of Nations. And they said, he's not even from Syria, he's from the Shuf. So how can he be claiming to represent the Syrians at the League of Nations? And so he was actually coming to the United States as a representative of Syrians at the League of Nations. But beyond that, he had friends among the Christians in the United States. He had friends among the Druze, among the Muslims, and he made sure to go around the United States and be with all of them. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I mean, I hope your next book is on Shakib al-Islam.
Somebody should write a new one, yes.
Yes, somebody.
Hi, thank you, Reem.
Thank you.
My name is Bianca, and I wanted to ask, how did the experiences of acculturation and assimilation in the diaspora influence the ways in which Syrians engaged with the revolt of 1925, and whether there was any connection or influence?
That's a great question. If we look at the event of Shakib Arslan's visit to the United States, you kind of get a glimpse into how they use their subjectivities as immigrants to the United States to sort of frame their participation in this revolt that was taking place abroad. And the ways they did this was to liken the revolt of 1925 to the American Revolution, that the Syrians were just attempting what the Americans attempted a century maybe at the time, 2 centuries earlier. So they kind of framed their participation in this long-distance nationalism as their patriotic duty, both as Americans and as Syrians and Lebanese. And vice versa, if they were supporting the Lebanese independence as a separate state, they often framed their there was this weird triangulation that was taking place at the time, where they had loyalty and connections to the French consuls and the French mandate officials, as well as very well connected to their local American officials and representatives. And so at the time it was a little bit more fluid, I would say. They could be Francophile, but at the same time, American citizens of a great Christian nation.
I believe, like Sultan Bashar al-Atrash, when he called for the revolution, he didn't say my fellow Druzes. He said my fellow Arabs or my fellow Syrian Arabs. So in general, the whole idea was the revolution. That's true. It started by a Druze such as Sultan Bashar. However, the revolution, when it went on and continuous, it was fought mostly in the Jabal al-Druze, but literally the people who went outside, such as Amir Arslan and others, they were representing the whole revolution as a revolution against the French. I mean, did you see, like, when they were well received in the US or any other place, they were received as a Druze or as a nationalist trying to go on with the revolution?
That's a great question. The American press was much more likely to depict them as, or at least depict Arslan in his trip as a Syrian nationalist, and in some cases depicted as a nationalist cause. But I think there was always an Orientalist way of depicting the rebellion from the French and from the American press, which was to view the Middle East and through the prism of sectarianism. And so it was always pointing out the Druze fighters, the Druze rebels, and so on. Whereas the activists and nationalists themselves, whether abroad or in Syria and Lebanon, saw themselves as part of partaking in this broader anti-imperialist, anti-colonial nationalist project. Did Druze identity not matter as a result? I don't think so. I think they continued to utilize their Druze identity to call for support, especially in the case where the revolt had crossed over into Lebanon and, you know, had crossed into territories where there was an important Druze population present and had relied on, you know, this idea of Druze brotherhood to gain support. But I think, you know, they were all aware of the fact that they were taking part in this nationalist rebellion. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank again Dr. Reem Bailony for this fascinating lecture. Thank you also for attending, and special support to the distinguished members of the ADF, for Fadi Zohairi for his support, and for all of you for braving this cold. I think it's warmer outside than it is in this room. And please, I hope to see you all at the reception at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. So once again, thanks to Reem.